Hello.
Hi, I'm Aura. Welcome to the open space. I have a very unusual guest tonight, which I struggle to introduce because it seems that I know Bruno, Dr. Bruno Chaouat forever. So I will ask Bruno to introduce himself.
All right.
Bruno.
Well, thank you for having me. My name is Bruno Chaouat, as you've pronounced beautifully. And I'm originally French, became US citizen 8 years ago or so. I've been living in this country for 30 years. And I've been teaching for a very long time, I would say a good 20 years at the University of Minnesota. I teach in the Department of French and Italian, and I work on literature and philosophy, mainly 20th, 21st century, and on very strange topics that we can discuss if you want or not. And what else? I'm interested in music. I play the piano thanks to you because I rediscovered piano.
What does it mean, thanks to me?
Thanks to you because you're my piano teacher.
You play piano despite my constant intimidation.
In spite of you, I play the piano.
In spite of me.
Yeah. And I've been rediscovering piano, I don't know how long ago. I don't really want to count because it makes me feel too old. And so, but it's been a while now. And so I've been very much interested in music, not just in the practice of it, but also somehow in its history and its philosophy of music as well. And basically what is music or the meaning of music. So these are questions that I've been actually touching recently in my work and in my intellectual involvement, I would say.
It's interesting, Bruno, because as a performing musician, I'm quite skeptical about the idea of theorizing about music or philosophizing about music. One part of me, at least, is skeptical. Another part of me loves all kinds of musings, including philosophical. So how do you juggle these two parts? One part of you that simply sit at the instrument and play music, and as you want, confess to me, simply because it keeps you sane. And the other part of you, which engages in some serious, I would say, theoretical research, cultural, musical, historical, etc.
Yeah, well, I've got a sort of intellectual perversion, so I sort of like thinking about stuff, and I like criticism, and I like, what you would call intellectualism or conceptualization of things, or theorization. But there is a difference between hands-on and minds-on, right? So that's quite obvious. But
don't you think that hands-on and minds-on, they not necessarily contradict each other, but they're rather complementary?
Yeah. So recently I read, I think I've talked to you about it. I've read the Leonard Bernstein extraordinary Harvard lectures. And you know what he does in those lectures? You can see it on YouTube. So you don't have to read the book. You can also listen to it because he was filmed probably for the public television at the time in the 1970s. And he is both, right? Extraordinarily hyper intellectual, and at the same time, hyper performer. So super performer, but that's, the ideal man, right? So it's very, very hard to do both. He did those lectures. He looks like he improvises, but I'm sure he does not, obviously. And he worked a lot on linguistics, and his whole idea was to try to analogize the language, as we call it, by metaphor of music with language itself.
Yeah. Well, I want to correct you because what perceived falsely, I think, improvisation perceived as something that just randomly happening on the spot in reality, it takes a lot of subtle and nuanced planning. It's just different kind of planning.
You know, I understand that.
Yeah.
I completely understand. I'm not saying that he is putting it out of his whatever, but he has been working for decades with thinking about music and not on. But it doesn't really matter. What matters is what he's trying to do. And I was really struck by the fact that he is extremely successful in making analogy, drawing analogies between phonology of music and phonology of language, between syntax of music and syntax of language. And I think I have a serious trouble when he tries to draw an analogy between semantic, which is meaning of language, and meaning of music. Because what he has a hard time doing, I think he acknowledges it at some point in his lectures, is to find the extra musical in the musical. Whereas in language, we find the extra linguistic. So when I say a table, I have a representation of a table in my head, I have the concept of a table, but there is also such a thing in the world called a table. Whereas it's very hard when you play Chopin Nocturne to, unless there is a programmatic, right, music, unless there is a title that tells you this is the moonlight or this is whatever, it is almost impossible. It is actually impossible, structurally impossible, to have an extra musical reference. So what is missing in music to be really the same or similar to a language is the external referent. And without that, you cannot have meaning in the sense that we understand the word for language.
Well, the meaning is there, except it's not external, it's internal, rather physiological, rather sensory. And on the other hand, again, you use word external referring to Bernstein. I would say it's maybe meta meaning. It's rather quintessential meaning of all meanings combined together. It's rather endless possibilities of meanings without having any particular one.
Well, he calls it ambiguity, right? So this is a very interesting word that he's using to the idea of ambiguity. But it is nonetheless fascinating that you find this in philosophers of music. There are not that many, actually. I think, I may be wrong on that, but besides Nietzsche and few philosophers of the tradition, maybe in antiquity, there are several who wrote about music. But among the moderns, there are very few who really engaged with music the same way as they've engaged with visual arts, I would say.
I'm actually pretty happy about it because sometimes I want to liberate music from the philosophy of it. And I really thinking a lot lately about beautiful words of my favorite jazz musician, Chick Corea, who said music is a pleasure of sound. Pleasure of sound. That's it.
It can be also the pain of sounds.
Pleasure always goes with pain.
Yeah, because there is some type of music which is very unpleasant. And here I'm limiting myself to the classical tradition. I'm not going into popular music. But if you limit yourself to the classical tradition, then you get a the post-Wagnerian music, which becomes atonal or post-tonal or whatever you want to call it. And it does not really aim at pleasure anymore, but at something else that you can certainly call discomfort or pain, or discord instead of accord.
The anti-aesthetic, right?
The anti-aesthetic, or the aesthetic of the, I think it's something that Adorno calls the aesthetic of the ugly or something like that. And there is a sense that you have to go there in order to transgress or to overcome all the limitations that are probably thought of as ideological, actually, by some composer of the early 20th century who are going against this, what they see as the constraints of a certain ideology of the beautiful, an ideology of the tonality, maybe, of the accord. In French, we would say l'accord, that is sort of consonants, if you will.
Yeah.
And
here is
harmony.
famous Schoenberg's emancipation of dissonance you're referring to, right?
Yeah, or emancipation by dissonance and emancipation from the harmony, right? And so that's a very, very intriguing phenomenon that cannot be really separated from history and the historical context.
Absolutely not. But if you take 20th century visual art, it's not your Renoir. And Renoir, it's not your Watteau, right? So it's all this happened historically in different areas of arts.
But going back to where were we? Going back to meaning. So there is also a great book by the French-Russian Jewish philosopher Vladimir Yankelevich, whom you may know, and it's called I think it's called The Ineffable in English. I think there is an English translation of it, and it's about music, and it's really the idea that music expresses without expressing. But there is some kind of a paradox like this that he likes to use, because again there is the stumbling block of the reference. What does it refer to? So again, you can have tons of diegetic, or how would you say, narrative or language or linguistic indications, you know, on a score, on a sheet of music, on the partition. You can have, you know, books and analysis written and the history of a piece that will give you tons of external indications about when it was written, to what effect, what is it supposed to. But if you take away really the piece of music from all those indications, you don't get, I would say, you don't get as much meaning as you get in the most avant-garde or experimental poem of the late 19th or early 20th century, because you still can cling to words, even if in poetry, right? Even if words are put you know, collated in a way that is emptying the meaning almost entirely, you still have those words. It's more difficult, if not completely structurally impossible for music. So that's something that interests me.
Yeah.
Because
music uses linguistic devices, absolutely, but takes it different direction. So, and that's interesting.
Yeah, well, it uses forms of transformations, you know, from, for example, from, how do you call those things? I'm not a technician of music, obviously, at all. But if you take, you know, diatonic or dominant chord or whatever, and then you transform it into subdominant or whatnot, right? There are all those things. So there are all those transformations that Bernstein, using Chomsky transformational or generative grammar, is capable of showing that there are structural, syntactic, if you will, resemblances, right? But again, meaning is complicated. So the question is interesting and relevant to the politicizing, for example, of music. If, you know, if music does not refer to something external to itself, then how can you construe the political meaning from an arrangement of sounds? That's a very interesting question. That is, we're not going to talk politics, at least not in a direct
it's
manner.
It's an interesting question, because you absolutely cannot do that unless you do it intentionally. But then music becomes a tool. in the hands of something or someone who wants to use it as a politicizing tool. That's a whole other story.
Yeah, but you are the one who is the real musician here, and also who has experience of, let's say, the end or the agony of the totalitarian state in the Soviet Union.
Yes.
And so you would know how that kind of perversion of music can happen. The thing is that there is not just a perversion, there is also an intention, right? So there were some official composers who were composing stuff that was supposed to be in praise of communism, or in praise of the people or the working class and so on. The question is, again, if you separate, or if you bracket the historical context and the political context, if you listen to that music without knowing, anything about the context, then how do you see the music, praising the working class? You can when you read a novel of socialist realism, but you can't really because you can listen to Chopin Polonaise and say, oh yes, it's in praise of the communism, but it's not, because it's anachronistic, right? It wouldn't work.
Absolutely.
So how do you, so you understand that there is a kind of tonality or a Stimmung, a sort of disposition or a mood.
I'll tell you how.
That is heroic, right?
You use songs. You use songs, and songs, they have words, right?
Yeah.
So where music used to accompany words. So words have a dominating role that carry certain political message.
Sure.
Now, more than that, if we talk about Soviet Russia, composers like Shostakovich or Prokofiev, they were like chameleons, right? They had to be to survive. So they composed several different kinds of music. One so-called official music, and another one, it was even expression, just like with writers, the famous expression, writing into the table, right? So no one will hear it, no one will hear it, no one will see it. So,
and that. My question is more primitive. My question goes to the core of music itself. Forget about lyrics or words. I'm not interested in them, but the sound itself, or the rhythm itself. How did we get to understand, anthropologically speaking, the sort of history of the species, or the history, that a certain rhythm is attuned with military, or is attuned with the heroic, or with the glorification of a tribe? These are very interesting questions. First of all, they are usually in major mode.
March, right? Very square,
for example,
very predictable. Yes.
Yeah. So how did we come to find a sort of formula that instills the feeling of combat and struggle and fighting for the tribe, and hypnotizing crowds and masses just with the music? I'm not talking of lyrics here. And that's a very interesting, it has to speak to something very, very primal in us.
Because music has this capacity of incitement. It incites, because again, remember in the beginning I said it has very complex biological or physiological or neurological impact on us, physical. So physically, music can do what, let's say, voice of dictator can do, right? Hypnotize people, right? Or what the voice of a priest can do. So music has this hypnotic element. Absolutely. In a way, it could be like a drug.
For me, this is as close as it gets to meaning and to politics, if you will. This is as close as it gets, because then you have a sort of mimetic music that speaks to almost our nerves, I would say,
Mhm.
and incites us. This reminds me a little bit of Walter Benjamin's famous essay,
Yeah.
Mechanical Reproduction in the Artwork.
Yep.
He doesn't talk so much about music, but he talks about the crowd, and he talks about the aestheticizing of politics, which becomes his definition for fascism. So aestheticizing politics. I wonder if this type of music is not a way of aestheticizing, not making it beautiful, but making it stimulating in a very physiological sense of the word, a form of sending some stimuli, nervous, neurological, almost, neurostimuli to the individual in the crowd that is going to coagulate, cement this mass of individuals together. So it's a complex mechanism that should be probably studied by neuroscientists.
But a whole group of people, neuroscientists, psychologists, absolutely. It's and they do it. They do it. I would love to have a conversation with group of people on that. And also definitely linguists, definitely historians. So it's a very complex conversation. But again, music can be used as a tool. And if you, the wonderful example, if you watched Clockwork Orange, right?
Of course, yeah.
Kubrick's, and you probably watched, I think I sent you Slavoj Žižek's 5 minutes.
No, I don't, yeah.
Yeah, Slavoj Žižek's interpretation of Beethoven Nines in the context of this film, it's worth seeing.
Yeah, so now the question becomes, how does music resist this captation by those instrumentalization, no pun implied, of the politics, right? How do you formally, conceptually, physically distinguish a Nazi or fascist march from a sonata? What is it that the sonata does in order to not be recuperated by politics? Where does it resist politics? Where is it that there is a form of resistance?
I won't give you direct answer because I don't know the answer, but I'll give you an example how much more difficult it is, because let's take even concentration camps, right? We're going to the most difficult topic, right? You have Nazis, right? Listening to most beautiful, not inciting, not marching, but most beautiful slow movement of Schubert's sonata, right? The sublime of the sublime. While sending people to gas chambers. They're not listening to the primitive marching music. They listen to mass nuance composition of a genius, right? So how you explain that?
Yeah, this is what...
And they appreciate it aesthetically. They cry. They're getting really sentimental about it.
Well, this reminds me of George Steiner, famous declaration, which is, by the way, extremely disturbing for someone who teaches the humanities like me. And his declaration in the castle of Bluebeard Castle, or whatever it's called, this title, Le Château de Barbe Bleue in French. And he says that humanities do not humanize. And so that would be the same for literature. That would be the same for philosophy when you think of philosophers joined the Nazi party and so on. And so the humanities, the arts, of course, and music, there is this whole, I mean, there is this whole idea that the art, the so-called degenerate art, was something that by its very name that the Nazis rejected. And that was the expressionism, and that was the modern art of the time, and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me that there was a form of rejection of a certain kind of art in the Nazi establishment. Same for music. They rejected, for example, the avant-garde type of music, post-Wagnerian, Schoenberg, and so on and so forth. So as degenerate, right? That was the word they were using for that kind of art. So the question is, perhaps Adorno was right to say that that kind of music and art was actually embodied a form of resistance to.
Absolutely.
But at the same time, it is an art. It can be an art, and it can be a type of music extraordinarily elitist, right? And I suppose that's the reason why the Soviets also rejected that kind of art and music, because they also saw that kind of music and art as something for the elite and against the working class, right?
Yeah.
So that's a question, because on the one hand, you want to defend the classical tonality, and you want to defend a music that is enjoyable or pleasurable, that gives pleasure. And on the other hand, you realize that this music was also loved by, Nazis and maybe Soviets.
Yeah.
And
well,
yeah.
just like Nazis enjoyed poetry of, let's say, Baudelaire, right?
I have no idea about that, but it's possible.
It's possible, right?
Maybe.
Yeah, it's I guess we have to accept the whole of history, all of it, and music is not an exception. Music was in this laundry machine from all the sides.
Yeah.
And I view music, again, you cannot close your eyes. I cannot close my eyes on political circumstance, right? At the time that music was created. But at the same time, that's not what me play music, and that's not what make you play music. It's something else about music that makes you play it as a person. And in final analysis, it's a marketplace of music. Marketplace, I'm not talking about capitalism, I'm talking about like bazaar. Think about gigantic Mediterranean bazaar where you enter and you have the whole totality of music. You have jazz, you have popular music, you have rock, you have, and by the way, what we call today classical, right? I really dislike this word. I really dislike this word, especially when it comes to music. Let's talk about, wait a second. When we talk about Schubert, he wasn't classic, he was popular composer at that time, right? So what we call classical was pop music at that time. So
I am not sure about that. I don't really know, but what we call classical is noted music, right? Not only, but it's the music that is noted, right? That is written, as opposed to more oral tradition, oral transmission of music.
You mean folk music?
Folk, yeah.
Folk, yeah.
But what I want to pivot a little bit, because I had a conversation with a music theorist recently, talked about the sort of touchstone of beauty and successful composition or beautiful composition, and the sort of criterion that was proposed by this friend of mine was complexity. And I am very reticent to this criterion. of complexity as a sort of touchstone for superiority or hierarchy in evaluating music. I am really far from sure that a simple song by Mendelssohn is not more beautiful than certain sonatas by Schoenberg, for example. But the
Or
question is,
a,
Schoenberg is more complex.
or a
Yeah.
simple folk tune from any region of the planet.
For
Just
example,
simple short folk tune, which,
yeah.
by the way, if we look at what we call classical composers, right?
Yeah.
Majority of them were actually deriving inspiration from the simple folk tunes and doing something with them.
Yeah. So the question, I mean, of course, you could argue that they were complexifying those simple tunes, right? They were making it more complex by adding lines and harmonies to the melody and so on and so forth. But if you stick to the so-called Baroque and classical music, I think that the criterion of complexity is not very convincing. And that it's not because of music or an art which is a high level of sophistication and syntax, so to speak, grammar, that it is more beautiful or more valuable even. So the question of the value and the valuation of art is also very important, because we live in an age when we cannot really hierarchize, say this, for example, Shakespeare is better than the new rap song by X or Y. At the same time, we are tempted to continue to hierarchize. And at the same time, I remain unconvinced that the criterion of complexity is good enough for making those hierarchies. It would be my tendency, right? I want to think against this natural tendency to hierarchize based on the sophistication, the grammar, the complexity, the syntax, and so on. How do we do that? Should we do that or not? I don't really know.
But let me ask you another question. Away from theorizing, but toward you, a person who are really in love with music, as I know you for many, many years, and you very diligently practicing and you constantly listening.
Thank you.
So music is a huge part of your life, as much as I know. Yes, comrade, you should say,
right.
or commissar, right?
Okay.
No. But what I wanted to say, what is the principle of how you choose music for you to play? I don't force you to play anything. Like,
no, it's a very good question. I have a very, very primitive taste in music.
Don't say primitive. Who decided that it's primitive? Who said so?
So my taste is very often based on the melody, as opposed to the complexity of the vertical arrangement.
But here is the secret of popular music. That's what makes popular music popular. It's this melody that is incredibly catchy. It triggers something instantaneous. And here it goes. And popular composers, they know the formula, the chemical formula.
Yeah, so there is in me a form of aesthetic sentimentality, which I do not reject, which I own. And it puts me a little bit at odds with a certain elitism of mine, right? If I want to psychoanalyze myself. So on the one hand, there is a sort of elitism you know, that you have to like, it's a social thing, right?
The theorist in you in
The
at
what?
odds with the practitioner in you, right?
Tourist? The what?
The theorist.
Theorist? No, I think there may be a sort of sociological determination behind that. It's not impossible. You know, Pierre Bourdieu, the French sociologist, who said that taste is completely, or distinction in taste is completely sociological, it's snobism. It's because the working class want to imitate the bourgeoisie and basically they like the same thing. But there is nothing more interesting in, there is nothing more valuable in the bourgeoisie's taste or the aristocracy's taste than there is in the working class taste. I am not sure that I agree with that because I'm too elitist for believing that. At the same time, I can see that there is many people, especially in the sort of post-bourgeoisie world in which we live, or the dictatorship, as some writers write, dictatorship of the petite bourgeoisie in which we live, that there is a sense of snobism and that people want to like what has been liked by the upper class for centuries or whatever. So it's always very difficult to distinguish between genuine taste, what really, how does Roland Barthes calls it in English, what really points me, he talked about punctum, right? So there must be a word in English for the verb from punctum, what really grips me, if you will. And what I consider that it's something that I should like, that I should enjoy. Like, for example, I would say like a Schoenberg, going back always to those, you know, early 20th century modernism or whatever, that you should, you know, Alban Berg or whatever. So you have to like that stuff because it has become part of the canon of people who are cultivated and educated and so on. So it's very complicated because it's hard to know. Now I know bloody well that if I listen to just my
You
heart,
talk like Brit, right? You use now word bloody. Right?
Yeah,
British
it's my
people
snob. It's my snobism. Yeah, it's my British snobism. So anyway,
you
yeah,
betray your French roots, right?
that's right. That's right. So no, the thing is that at some point it's difficult, but at the same time, if I listen to my inner guts, you know, then I will go with simpler music that are not necessarily simple because I absolutely adore Bach. So they are. It's far from simple. Bach is probably one of the most complex composers because of counterpoint and so on. Nonetheless, you know, if I do not hear a line that is a sort of, how would you call it, like the surface line or whatever, you know, the melody,
the
the
motive,
motif, maybe a phrase,
the melos
of the melody. If I don't hear that, even in complex pieces by Brahms or whoever, it's very hard for me to get attached to a piece of music. And it doesn't mean that you cannot hear that in, I can hear that in very complex compositions, like Mahler Ninth Symphony, for example. You know, I can hear that. So that's fine.
It was not meant to provoke attachments. Don't you think so? Again, we talk about different aesthetic.
What was not meant to?
That kind of music you're talking about.
Which one?
Well, let's say Schoenberg, right?
Oh, I don't know. Yeah, well, I don't know about this because it is haunting, right? It is full of ghosts. If you take Erwartung, this monodrama, where you have this woman who is waiting for her dead beloved, I think, or something like that.
Yep.
And you have a sort of, so it is haunting. So it is extraordinarily dissonant. It is pungent. It is aggressive. It is expressionist. But I am not sure that I would say that it's not meant to attach. I'm not sure. It is meant to be enjoyed, it's not the word obviously, but to be loved, or to at least invoke or provoke a form of feeling of the sublime, right? So it is a sublime piece as opposed to a beautiful piece, right? So it's a piece that can afford being dissonant, that can afford being aggressive, that can afford, being I'm trying to find words. Yeah, I mean, aggressive and hurt you, and hurt you, because when you listen to the soprano, whatever singer it is, it is very, very painful. So it is meant to convey the extreme trauma of the loss, or the waiting for the lost one. So I understand that. And I can imagine that many people have been haunted by this and wanted to listen to it again and again. But it's not the kind of music that I enjoy listening to. I can understand its philosophy. I can understand its aesthetic. I can understand its intent. I cannot be gripped by it. I cannot be really touched by it.
But again, this music was composed to disturb, not to make you enjoy and feel cozy in your next to your fireplace with a glass of wine.
It is true, and so the question is that there is a turning point, the 20th century, in the arts, as you said, not only, of course, in music.
Yeah,
and
just like Shostakovich.
Yeah.
Yes.
And the question is it, because I think that Schoenberg dies just before World War I believe. So, the question is it some kind of prophecy or anticipation of the disaster to come? There is almost something like this, right? In a sort of mass grave that Europe is going to be very soon, at least twice in a period of 50 years or less than 30 years. And so maybe he was the visionary of that collective mass trauma of the 20th century.
Absolutely, just like in many ways, a large part of the 20th century art and literature. Think about Kafka.
Yeah, of course.
So it's interesting conundrum because music rebels its politicization of itself, and yet music is not born out of social vacuum either, right? Because the composer, the person who composed music, is a part of the history, part of belonging to his or her history at that time.
Yeah, well, I would argue, I would suggest to say that music is profoundly historical, but it cannot be recuperated by slogan politics. It's impossible. Otherwise, we're not talking of music. We're talking of something else. We're talking of sophisticated jingles or whatever, but not music. So yeah, but part of history, yes, because music is also a commentary on history, an extremely complex, or even I would say silent in the sense it makes noise but doesn't make meaning. Commentary on history.
Which means it brings us to very important distinction that I think it's important to make, especially these days. Absolutely, yes, we cannot consider music out of historical context when it was composed, just like any piece of art or literature or philosophy, or take anything. On the other hand, it cannot be used as a primitive tool of political weaponization, if you will.
Yeah, I totally agree. Because this commentary on history is not a sort of dogmatic or partisan commentary. I would say more than commentary. I think it responds to historical situations or context. You can have Beethoven responding to Napoleon, for example.
But let me give you some funny, again, to a certain extent, we cannot be absolutists here. Let me give you a funny anecdote, which is actually a true fact. One of Beethoven's friends who attended premiere of one of Beethoven's late sonatas. I don't want to lie because I don't know exactly which one particularly. And next day he writes Beethoven a letter expressing his excitement of this piece, and he say Beethoven, it was incredibly intense and epic and tragic. You probably were thinking about French Revolution at the time that you composed this specific sonata. Guess what was Beethoven's reply? When I composed it, I had excruciating tooth pain.
That's really good.
Here we go. Yeah. So to what extent we can rely? So it basically immediately erases all our assumptions about meaning of music.
Yeah, absolutely. Right? Absolutely. That's a very good anecdote. Is it in Beethoven's diary, or in, you remember we've seen
it's in letters, in letters. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So so it takes us back to meaning.
To the limits that music transcends limits of meaning we attach to it. I would put it this way.
Yeah, and I think that music is concerned with moods and concerned with affects.
And with immediacy.
Yeah, and is not concerned with concepts. So you could make the argument that it's the same for poetic prose or for poetry, that it's concerned with moods, and with affects as opposed to concepts. But you are still stumbling on words that have a meaning or a semantic value.
Yeah, but I have to disagree with you because there is conceptual music. And if you take John Cage 4.33, what is that?
Yeah, it's silence. But yeah, it's a piece of silence. But it's more.
Is it? Or it's because in his own words, everything is music. Is it silence or it's a accumulation of everything?
But it takes me back to the distinction between beautiful and sublime. And the beautiful is about form, and the sublime is about the presentation of. It's called it's Lyotard and Kant before Lyotard, of course, talked about negative presentation, right? So he says you present something negatively as opposed to positively. So you're not representing someone, you're not making a portrait, you're making a white square, for example, right? White on white or whatever. So Malevich, right? For example. And so that's sublime because it presents, but negatively, it presents the impossibility of representing in a way. And I think that's what John Cage is doing, a form of aesthetic of the sublime, which according to Lyotard is actually the criterion of the aesthetic of the avant-garde in the arts, or modernism. And I think it makes lots of sense. And so John Cage is part of that. So do we enjoy it? No. Do we hear something? Yes.
Well, you speak. What do you mean? Do we enjoy it? No. Are you speaking on behalf of?
We are not enjoying. We are actually we can be touched by it. It's certainly not a touch of pleasure. It's something else, and it's probably if it is conceptual, as you call it, although I think it's different from conceptual art in the visual arts.
It's a music refusal of defining itself.
Yeah, or it's also a way of presenting what cannot be heard or what cannot be translated in music, right? So basically composing silence means composing the impossibility of composing. So I think in that sense, it makes a statement, right?
Yeah.
It makes a statement about the limits maybe of composition or the limits of sound when we have gone through Schoenberg and gone through the revolution of post-tonal music and gone through Stockhausen and gone through Boulez and gone through all those people. And then we say, well, okay, now what do we do? And maybe what we do is present the impossibility of composing something. So to me, that's how I understand this, this piece. So you can, listen to it for 4 minutes if you want. You can also leave the room and say, I don't like to be made fun of. It's grotesque, right?
Yeah.
And then you pass for reactionary because you don't like modernism or postmodernism. And then, so there are all those things. So I think it belongs to, and goes back to what we said in the beginning, it goes back to some kind of aesthetic of the sublime as opposed to form and to representation.
Are you concerned about some examples of politicization of music these days in the world? Or it's not of your concern?
Politicization, yeah. I mean, if you read any kind of article on, if you read any kind of article on a scholarly article, academic article on rap or hip hop, you're always immediately going to talk about racism, non-racism, claims, social justice, and so on. So there is a form of politicization, of kind of instrumentalization of those rappers or hip hop, composers and so on. Now the thing is that the hermeneutic is not a betrayal, because there is usually an intention of reclaiming, rights, or reclaiming or denouncing injustice and things like that in there. Again, in the lyrics, much more than in the music itself, right? But if you read the lyrics, of course, you're going to see that it's against the cops, it's against the police, it's against injustice, and so on. So that's fine. So that there is a politicization, and there is also recent cases of politicizing classical music and tonal music, or diatonic music, as music that is the music of the Eurocentric dominant culture. And that's, recent cases in music theory milieu or circles, where you have that sort of argument that everything from Bach to Brahms or whatever is considered as a form of oppression and domination, and that tonal music is based on the dominant of the diatonic. And as such, it's basically a hierarchical system that embodies, so to speak, the hierarchy that is, Eurocentric. So we have those politicization, and we've always had politicizings of music. We had politicizing of music in the Third Reich and in Soviet Union and so on.
Yeah. When you mentioned word hermeneutics, I don't even know how to spell it, right? I remember the very last line of my favorite Susan Sontag essay, Against Interpretation, where she say, give me back the erotics of music, right? Oh, the music? Eros of music. Yeah. So it's, I was thinking, definitely there is a lot of kind of surreal, I would say, tendencies around music going on. My hope is that musicians, especially in post-COVID situation, I relate a lot of it to COVID, not only to COVID, will be too busy playing music, and audiences will be too busy enjoying live concerts, and that somehow this popping out here and there political sort of provocations will dissolve. That's my hope.
Well, that's my wish too.
That's maybe that's
our dream.
But let me give you example. I just recently, I have students from India, my students, undergrads, who I ask them what you want to play, and I try to be very diverse in choices that I provide them, because I love music from everywhere. I love folk music. I love Latin American music. I learn now about Indian music. It's fascinating. So a student from India say, I want to play Chopin.
Yeah.
And I say, why? Because I like it. It speaks to me.
Of course.
So speaking, we're going back to language, but it speaks to me.
Yeah, in the language of moods, I would put
in
it.
the language of whatever. It speaks to the body, to the soul, in the language of soul, or whatever. Again, it speaks its own language, language of music. So.
Well, we agree on that. Next time we talk, it will be maybe more fun. It was a little serious today.
A little bit. Yes.
Okay.
So we will need to have some desserts, right? Or appetizers, hors d'oeuvres, right?
Some wine.
Yes.
Okay.
And maybe I will finally end up experimentations with, I will make my piano sound in a more decent way, because I'm a little bit skeptical about my technological resources to make piano sound decent. Maybe we can do some chansons.
Absolutely.
I also would like people who watching us, and if they haven't disconnected through conversation, please write us your comments, or I would love you to join us, because I'm plotting to do maybe some sort of salon-like events. Bruno, what do you say with you?
It's a great idea. With technology, we can probably do that.
Technology.
It would be even better to do it in person, but then it means that the people who are watching the channel are not going to be close to us. So,
but at least we can have wine, right? We can say, or foods or stuff.
Yeah. Virtual cheers. All right.
Virtual cheers.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you, Bruno. I'll see you soon.
See you soon.
And to be continued.
To be continued. Bye-bye, Orion.
Thank you, everybody, for watching. And please, I would love to see your comments, your thoughts, and your critique. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.